A Soviet Union B-59 submarine was hiding deep underwater in the Caribbean Sea, just a few kilometers away from the US, fully prepared for an attack. But then the US Navy discovered it and started dropping small bombs underwater to force it to surface. The Soviet submarine had already lost contact with its headquarters, thousands of kilometers away. The captain of the submarine believed that war had already begun, and now was the time to fire a nuclear torpedo missile. This was the moment when tensions between the US and the Soviet Union had reached an extreme. Thousands of nuclear missiles from both countries were just one button press away from being launched. The Soviet submarine captain was about to press the nuclear missile button when suddenly something happened that saved the world from destruction. Welcome back to another exciting video, dear viewers. This event took place during those 12 days in history when the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union was spiraling out of control. During the World War II, the entire world had witnessed the devastating effects of nuclear bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It also saw America's terrifying power. At that time, the only country capable of challenging the US was the Soviet Union. Right after World War II, the Soviet Union became the second country to successfully develop nuclear technology. They conducted multiple nuclear tests, indirectly signaling to America, "We are not Japan, who will stay silent after an attack." This was the Cold War era when both America and the Soviet Union kept their nuclear weapons ready at all times, whether the attack was from land, air, or sea. The world knew very well that if either country launched a nuclear strike, the other would retaliate with nuclear missiles. The destruction from this war would be far more horrific than Hiroshima and Nagasaki, potentially wiping out 70% of humanity. To make these attacks more effective, American and Soviet bomber aircraft were always in the air, and their nuclear submarines patrolled international waters, staying hidden and waiting for a single command. Additionally, the US deployed nuclear weapons in Turkey and Italy because these NATO allies were located close to the Soviet Union's borders. This gave America a strategic advantage, making it easier to target the Soviet Union's western regions. When the Soviet Union learned about America's strategy, they decided to deploy their own nuclear weapons near the US. The best location for this was Cuba, just 200 kilometers southeast of Florida. At that time, Cuba had a pro-communist government, which was unacceptable to the US. In America's eyes, Cuba was an ally of the Soviet Union because the Soviets were the stronghold of communism. Communism meant that all businesses would be controlled by the government, and everyone would receive an equal share, eliminating rich and poor classes. However, America wanted to spread capitalism, where free markets allowed anyone to run businesses and generate profit. The US wanted to attack Cuba and establish a capitalist system, but Cuban President Fidel Castro was protected by the Soviet Union, which also supplied Cuba with weapons. But behind this diplomatic friendship, the Soviet Union had a different plan. Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev secretly negotiated a deal with Fidel Castro, agreeing that the Soviet Union would deploy its intercontinental ballistic missiles, which ICBMs, in Cuba. In return, the Soviets would protect Cuba from a US invasion. But this deal had another major advantage. The Soviet Union could now easily target the US from the South American region. America discovers the secret missile bases. This deal was highly classified and no one outside knew about it. However, rumors started spreading across America and panic ensued. People feared that Soviet nuclear missiles were already installed just 200 kilometers from Florida. The White House denied these rumors and reassured people during the 1962 US election campaign that these were baseless claims. But to uncover the truth, the US Air Force deployed a U-2 spy plane to photograph Cuba from above. The photos confirmed the existence of Soviet R-12 medium-range and R-14 intermediate-range ballistic missile facilities in Cuba. These images shocked American President John F. Kennedy. He decided to teach Cuba a lesson a country the US already despised. His plan was to launch airstrikes to destroy Soviet missile bases in Cuba and to launch a full military invasion of Cuba. However, this plan was essentially an invitation to World War III because an attack on Soviet missiles in Cuba would be considered an attack on the Soviet Union itself. If this happened, nuclear war would break out, and no one would be able to stop it. When the Soviet Union learned about America's intention to attack, they prepared for war. One part of this preparation included the Soviet B-59 nuclear submarine, mentioned at the start of this video. This B-59 submarine was ordered to hide deep in the Caribbean Sea near Cuba. Its crew had full authority to launch a nuclear torpedo missile without waiting for permission from Moscow if war started. However, the submarine had gone so deep underwater that it had lost radio contact with Moscow. At the same time, the US Navy suspected that a Soviet submarine was hiding nearby. To force it to surface, the US Navy started dropping small bombs called signal depth charges weapons that could destroy the submarine if detonated nearby. Inside the B-59, the captain assumed war had already begun and prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo missile. Even though the crew had full authority to launch, the decision required approval from all 3 officers on board. 2 officers voted to launch the nuclear torpedo, but one officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. A heated debate erupted inside the submarine. Arkhipov argued that launching a nuclear missile was extremely risky since they had no confirmation that war had started. After several minutes of intense argument, they decided to surface and re-establish contact with Moscow before taking action. Meanwhile, a high-level meeting between the US and Soviet presidents took place to de-escalate the crisis. The Soviet Union agreed to remove its nuclear missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the US secretly agreed to remove its missiles from Italy and Turkey. These 12 days of extreme tension are known today as the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the closest moments to World War had Vasily Arkhipov not stopped the launch, the world as we know it might not exist today. We hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, share, and comment. See you in the next one.